They thought it was just a driveway, until it started charging them by the hour. The first thing I heard wasn't the engines. It was the crunch. Gravel shifting under weight it was never meant to carry. Slow. Grinding. Wrong for 2:47 in the morning. I was already awake, watching the glow of my security monitor cut through the dark like a second set of eyes. Headlights swept across my property, confident, uninvited. One car turned in, then another, then a third, each one rolling over the same stretch of land I paid $20,000 extra to keep private. My driveway, my easement, my line in the sand. The timestamp blinked steady in the corner. Cold, precise, unarguable. And still, they kept coming. White beams slicing through the dark like permission had already been granted. It hadn't. The smell of fresh asphalt still lingered, clean, sharp, something I paid for. Maintained. Protected. Now mixed with exhaust fumes leaking through my window. Uninvited. I sat there, barefoot, hardwood cold beneath me, counting. 5 cars. 7. 10. By 11, one angled halfway onto my lawn. I knew. This wasn't a mistake. Not confusion. Not coincidence. This was routine. Expected. Organized. I leaned forward. Watched one driver step out. Lock his door. Calm. Casual. Like he'd done it before. No hesitation. No glance at the property markers. Just certainty. And that's the part people don't understand. Confidence like that doesn't come from guessing. It comes from being told you're allowed. I already knew who told them. Brenda Whitmore. HOA president. White BMW. Perfect nails. That polished smile that never quite reaches her eyes. The kind of person who says community standards, like it outranks ownership. The first time we met, she stood right at the edge of this driveway. Clipboard tucked at her side. Talking about shared access. Like it was already decided. I remember the sunlight hitting her glasses, hiding whatever expression she didn't want seen. I told her calm. Clear. This isn't shared. I bought this strip separately. It's private. She smiled, nodded, and said, we'll see about that. Turns out, she meant every word. Because it didn't happen all at once. It never does. First, 1 car. Halfway in. Then 2. Then 3 during a weekend gathering I was never invited to. Every time, I handled it the same way. Knocked. Spoke calmly. Showed paperwork. Even printed the survey map, highlighted in yellow, like I was teaching a class no one wanted to take. And every time, same answer. Shrugs. Smiles. Brenda said it's fine. That sentence spread like it meant something. Like it rewrote lines. Like her voice carried more weight than a legal boundary. The worst part wasn't the inconvenience. Even though backing out at 7 a.m. with cars boxed in comes close. No, it was the assumption. That quiet agreement. That my space wasn't really mine. That if enough people ignored a line, it disappears. I stood up. Walked closer to the screen. Zoomed in. License plate sharpening into focus. Numbers clicking into place. Recognition. Same car. Same one from last Tuesday. Same one that blocked me in. Same driver that laughed when I asked him to move. My jaw tightened. Not anger. Something colder. Calculation. Because this wasn't parking anymore. This was permission. And permission is only real when it's enforced. Outside, another car pulled in. Headlights flared, then died. The driver stepped out. Stretching. Relaxed. Like he had arrived somewhere he belonged. I exhaled. Slow. Controlled. They weren't hiding. They weren't even thinking about it. And that told me everything. I reached for my phone. Scrolled to a name I hadn't touched in years. Someone who doesn't argue. Doesn't warn. Just solves problems. My thumb hovered. Then pressed. The line rang. Soft. Steady. Below, doors slammed shut. One after another. Echoing across land that was never meant to hold this many cars. They walked away. Leaving everything behind. Like it would still be there in the morning. That's when I smiled. Just a little. Because they were wrong about one thing. They thought they were using my driveway. They weren't. They were entering it. And there's a difference. A big one. Because once you enter something that's privately controlled, you don't get to decide the rules anymore. You agree to them, whether you realize it or not. So let me ask you this. If people kept taking from you like it didn't matter, would you keep explaining? Or would you change the system so they had to learn the hard way? Because I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need signs. Or warnings. Or another conversation with Brenda. I just needed the right night. The right setup. And a little patience. Because the moment that first ticket printed and the gate closed behind them, that driveway, stopped being a shortcut, and started becoming something else. Something expensive, something unavoidable, something they would remember every single time they tried to take something that didn't belong to them. I bought this place for one reason, and it was not the house. The house was fine, 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, nothing special, but the land behind it and the narrow strip leading to the street, that was the real prize. 32 feet wide, 180 feet long, a private access easement carved out in the late 80s by a rancher who hated sharing anything he owned. I respected that. I paid for that. When I signed the closing papers, the agent made a point of repeating it twice, like it was a selling feature you do not overlook. "This driveway is not part of the HOA," she said, tapping the survey with a manicured nail. "You own it outright." I remember the way the paper felt under my hand. Smooth, official, final. No ambiguity. No shared language. Just a clean boundary drawn in black ink. That mattered to me more than square footage or granite countertops ever could. I had spent 12 years in commercial development, negotiating easements, right-of-ways, access disputes that turned neighbors into enemies overnight. I knew exactly how ugly things could get when people thought they had a claim to land that was not theirs. So when I left that world behind, sold my stake, and decided to buy something quieter just outside Austin, I made one rule for myself. No shared access. No overlapping rights. No one else telling me how to use my own property. This driveway checked every box. It curved just enough to break line of sight from the street, lined with crushed limestone that gave off that dry, dusty scent every time tires rolled over it. In the mornings, the sound was soft and familiar, like cereal underfoot, a steady crunch that told me exactly where I was. Mine. That was the word that kept coming back. Mine to maintain, mine to use, mine to protect. I spent the first month making it exactly how I wanted. Regrade the slope so rainwater drained clean. Installed low-profile lighting along the edges, warm white, nothing flashy, just enough to guide a car at night without spilling into the neighbor's yard. I even sealed the surface myself, spending an entire weekend under the Texas sun, the smell of asphalt sticking to my clothes long after I showered. It was work, but it was the kind of work that felt honest. Direct. You put something in, you see the result. No committees. No votes. No one second-guessing your decisions. That piece lasted exactly 23 days after I moved in. That was when the first HOA notice showed up in my mailbox, a thin envelope with thick language inside. Community access considerations, it said, like it was introducing an idea I had somehow missed. I stood there in my driveway reading it, the afternoon heat rising off the surface in waves, and I could feel that old instinct kicking in, the one that used to tell me when a project was about to go sideways. They were testing the edges. Not with force, not yet, but with words. Suggestions. Phrases that sounded harmless until you looked closer. Shared benefit. Overflow accommodation. Temporary use. I folded the letter once, then again, slipping it back into the envelope without responding. I knew this game. You do not react to the first move. You watch. You document. You wait. A few days later, I saw Brenda for the first time in person. She walked the neighborhood like she owned the sidewalks, clipboard in hand, white SUV parked just a little too close to the curb like it had priority over everything else. When she stopped at my driveway, she did not ask permission. She just stepped onto it, heels clicking against the surface I had just finished sealing. I remember that sound more than anything. Sharp. Out of place. She glanced around, taking it in, then looked at me like we were already in the middle of a conversation. "This would really help during events," she said, gesturing toward the open stretch behind me. I kept my voice even, steady. "It is not part of the association." She smiled, the kind that tries to soften a statement without changing it. Everything connects eventually. That was the moment I understood exactly what she was. Not loud, not aggressive, just patient enough to blur lines until no one remembered where they were supposed to be. I nodded once, more to end the conversation than agree with anything she said, and watched her walk back toward her car. The sunlight caught the chrome trim. As she opened the door, a brief flash that made me squint. She drove off like she had already planted something that would grow whether I liked it or not. I stood there for a while after she left, listening to the quiet settle back in, the distant hum of sprinklers, the faint rustle of leaves along the fence line. It felt the same, but it was not. Because now I knew someone was looking at this place and seeing opportunity instead of ownership. And once that idea takes hold, it does not stay small for long. That was the day I started checking every line of my deed again. Brenda Whitmore did not raise her voice, and that was exactly what made her dangerous. The first time you saw her, you would not think twice. Early 50s, perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved even in the Texas wind, nails always immaculate, and that white BMW parked at just the right angle so it caught the light like it was part of the neighborhood branding. She dressed like she had somewhere important to be, even when she was just walking between houses with that clipboard tucked against her hip like a badge. But it was not the way she looked that mattered. It was the way people reacted when she showed up. Conversations stopped. Neighbors straightened up. Someone always found a reason to suddenly adjust their mailbox or trim a hedge that did not need trimming. It was subtle, but it was there. That quiet pressure of someone who had convinced an entire neighborhood that her opinion carried weight beyond what any document actually said. I started noticing it in the small things first. The way she never knocked on doors, she just appeared. The way she spoke in statements, not questions. That trash can needs to be moved. Those lights are not compliant. We are standardizing access points. She never said please, and she never said maybe. It was always framed like a decision had already been made somewhere else, somewhere higher, and she was just the one delivering it. That was her real skill, making people believe the rules came from somewhere bigger than her. A few days after that first letter, I watched her from my front window as she stopped 2 houses down. A man in his 60s, retired from the look of him, stood in his driveway holding a hose. She talked. He nodded. Within 10 minutes, he was moving his own fence line back 3 feet, like he had just realized it was in the wrong place all along. I remember the sound of the metal posts scraping against the ground as he pulled them up, that hollow clang echoing down the street. No argument. No hesitation. Just compliance. That told me everything I needed to know. This was not about enforcement. This was about conditioning. By the end of that week, I had seen it happen 4 more times. A mailbox repainted. A shed relocated. A parked truck suddenly gone. Every change small on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Brenda did not push hard. She nudged, repeatedly, until the line moved without anyone noticing. And once it moved, she treated it like it had always been there. When she came back to my driveway the second time, she did not even pretend it was a conversation. She stood there, looking down the length of it like she was evaluating a resource, not someone's property. "We have an event next weekend," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard. "We will need additional parking overflow." I crossed my arms, keeping my voice level. "This is private access. It is not available." She did not react right away, just looked at me for a second longer than normal, like she was deciding how much resistance she was dealing with. Then that same practice smile came back. "It will only be temporary." "No," I said, simple, clear, no room for interpretation. The air between us felt still for a moment, the kind of quiet that comes before something shifts. She tapped her pen lightly against the clipboard, once, twice, then nodded like she had agreed to something I had not offered. "We will make sure it is handled properly," she said, turning away before I could respond. That phrasing stuck with me. Not if, not maybe, just handled. Like the outcome was already decided and I was just behind on understanding it. The following Saturday, I learned exactly what she meant. I woke up to the sound of tires again, not as many as that night I saw on the monitor later, but enough to make the pattern clear. 3 cars parked along the edge, careful not to block the full width. Like they were testing how far they could go without triggering a reaction. I stepped outside. The morning air still cool, the smell of cut grass drifting over from somewhere down the block, and walked straight toward the nearest driver as he got out. "You cannot park here," I said, pointing to the boundary marker set flush with the ground. He glanced at it, then back at me, a little unsure but not concerned. "Brenda said it was fine," he replied, like that settled everything. There it was again. That sentence. Simple, confident, and completely detached from reality. I took a slow breath, feeling the heat starting to rise under my collar, but I kept my tone even. "Brenda does not own this property." He hesitated, just for a second, then shrugged. "I am just here for the event." And that was the problem. None of them thought it was their decision. They were all just following instructions. Instructions that came from someone who had decided my property was a solution to her problem. I watched him walk away, leaving his car exactly where it was, the tires pressing into the edge of my driveway like they belonged there. That was the moment it stopped being about misunderstanding. This was deliberate, organized, repeated, and if I did not stop it, it was going to become permanent. I looked down the length of the driveway, the line I had checked twice in the deed, the space I had built to stay mine, and realized something had already changed. They were not asking anymore, and that meant the next move was not going to be theirs. I did not argue the next time it happened, and that alone seemed to confuse them. The following weekend, the pattern repeated, but it came faster this time, like they had skipped the testing phase entirely. By 9 in the morning, there were already 6 cars lined along the edge of my driveway, angled just enough to pretend they were not fully on it, but close enough that I could not pull out without threading between mirrors and bumpers like I was navigating an obstacle course I never agreed to build. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops, and already the air carried that warm, dry smell of dust and asphalt heating up, mixing with the faint scent of someone grilling somewhere down the block. It would have been a normal Saturday if not for the fact that I was standing in my own driveway, keys in hand, waiting for strangers to finish using it. I walked out anyway, slow, deliberate, letting the crunch of gravel under my boots carry just enough weight to be noticed. A couple of people glanced over, then looked away just as quickly, like eye contact might turn into responsibility. One woman adjusted her sunglasses and kept walking, a drink in her hand, laughing at something someone said behind her. None of them saw a problem. That was the part that settled something in me. This was no longer about convincing anyone. This was about correcting behavior that had already taken root. I reached the first car and stopped, looking at how close the tires sat to the boundary marker, barely an inch off. Intentional, careful, like they had been told exactly how far they could go without technically crossing a line. I could almost hear Brenda's voice in it, explaining the margins, framing it like a compromise that only worked in one direction. I stepped back and pulled my phone out, not to call anyone, not yet, but to start recording. Plate numbers, positions, timestamps, the small details that people ignore until they matter. I moved from car to car, methodical, documenting each one without saying a word. A man near the end of the row noticed and gave me a half smile, the kind people use when they think they are dealing with someone who is overreacting. Just for a few hours, he said, like that was supposed to make it acceptable. I did not respond. I just kept moving, letting the silence do more work than any argument would. By the time I reached the last vehicle, I had 12 plates logged and a clear picture of exactly how far this had gone. When I finally turned back toward the house, I saw Brenda standing at the edge of the street, watching. She had that same clipboard in her hand, pen resting lightly against the paper, like she was checking off a task that had already been completed. She did not wave. She did not approach. She just stood there, observing, measuring the outcome of something she had set in motion. I held her gaze for a second, long enough to make it clear I saw her, then walked inside without breaking stride. That seemed to satisfy her. Or maybe it confirmed what she already believed, that I was not going to do anything about it. Inside, the house felt cooler, quieter, insulated from the noise outside, but the low hum of engines and distant conversations still filtered through the walls. I set my keys on the counter and looked at the monitor again, switching between camera angles, watching the flow of people moving through a space they had no claim to. It was efficient, I had to give her that. She had turned my driveway into a solution for her events without spending a dime, without filing a single document, just by convincing enough people that it was already allowed. That kind of strategy only works when no one pushes back in a way that matters. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, replaying the last few weeks in my head. The letter, the conversation, the first car, the repetition, each step small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a clear line from suggestion to assumption to action. That was the escalation. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, like water finding its way through a crack until the whole structure shifts. I knew exactly how this would end if I let it continue. In another month, maybe 2, there would be no hesitation at all. Cars would line both sides. People would walk through without even noticing the boundary markers. And if I ever tried to stop it then, I would be the one seen as unreasonable, disrupting something that had become normal. That was how control changed hands without anyone realizing it. I pushed off the counter and walked back to the window, watching as another car pulled in, this one not even bothering to angle carefully. It rolled straight onto the center of the driveway, stopping wherever it was convenient, like the decision had already been made for them. I exhaled slowly, feeling that same cold clarity settle in again, the kind that comes right before you stop reacting and start planning. Because at this point, it was not about proving ownership anymore. It was about reminding them what it actually meant. I turned away from the window, already thinking through the next steps, the kind that do not rely on conversations or assumptions, the kind that leave no room for interpretation. And for the first time since this started, I realized something important. They were not going to stop on their own. I gave them one last chance to make it easy, even though I already knew they would not take it. Monday morning came quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a neighborhood after a busy weekend. And for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had happened. The driveway was empty again, clean, the surface still holding faint tire impressions that would fade by noon. I stood there with a mug of coffee in my hand, the heat rising against my fingers, watching the sunlight stretch across the length of it like it was reclaiming something that had been temporarily borrowed. But I knew better. This was not over. This was just the pause between rounds. I walked back inside, grabbed the folder I had put together the night before, and headed straight for the HOA office. It sat in a small strip of storefronts about 10 minutes away, tucked between a dry cleaner and a tax service, the kind of place that looked official without actually being important. The air inside smelled faintly of printer toner and cheap air freshener, a mix that always reminded me of temporary authority. Brenda was already there, sitting behind a desk like she had been expecting me. The clipboard was gone, replaced by a laptop and a neat stack of papers, but the posture was the same. Composed. In control. She looked up as I walked in, that familiar smile appearing like it was part of a uniform. "Ethan," she said, like we were on a first-name basis that I had agreed to. "What can I do for you?" I did not sit. I set the folder down on her desk and opened it, sliding the top document toward her. Survey maps. Deed copies. Property descriptions with clear boundary markings. No ambiguity. No interpretation needed. "This driveway is private," I said, keeping my tone even measured. "It is not part of the association, and it is not available for parking or overflow." She glanced down at the papers, not reading them so much as acknowledging their presence, then leaned back slightly in her chair. "We are aware of your concerns," she replied, folding her hands together like this was a routine discussion she had handled 100 times before. "The community has certain needs during events, and we are simply making accommodations that benefit everyone." I let that sit for a second, the phrasing settling in the air between us. Benefit everyone. It sounded reasonable until you looked at who was actually giving something up. "It does not benefit me," I said, "and you do not have the authority to use it." Her smile did not change, but there was a slight tightening at the corners, just enough to signal that I had stepped outside the script she preferred. "Authority is not the issue here," she said. "Cooperation is." That was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. She understood exactly what she was doing. She just believed she could redefine the terms until resistance felt unreasonable. I closed the folder slowly, keeping my movements controlled. "This is your notice," I said. "Do not use my property again." She nodded, almost pleasantly, like she had just been informed of something minor. "We will take that into consideration," she replied. Not agreement. Not compliance. Just another soft deflection that kept everything exactly where she wanted it. I left without saying anything else, the door closing behind me with a dull click that felt louder than it should have. Outside, the heat hit harder, the sun already climbing, reflecting off windshields and pavement in sharp flashes. I stood there for a second, letting the reality settle in. I had done it the right way, provided documentation, stated my position clearly, given formal notice, and it had not changed a thing. That was the part that mattered. Not the conversation itself, but the outcome. Because now there was no room left for assumptions about intent. This was deliberate. When the next weekend came, it was worse. Not just a few cars testing the edges, but a full line running nearly the entire length of the driveway. Some parked so far in that they crossed completely over the boundary markers without even pretending to respect them. Music drifted from down the street, voices carrying through the warm afternoon air, and my driveway had become part of the event like it had always been included. I stood at the edge, watching it happen in real time, and felt something shift. Not anger, not frustration, Something quieter. Final. Because I had seen this before, in contracts, in negotiations, in projects that spiraled out of control when one side decided rules were optional. There is a point where discussion stops being useful. A point where the only language left is consequence. I looked down at the row of cars, then back toward the street where more were pulling in, and for the first time since this started, I did not step forward to say anything. I did not knock on doors. I did not point to markers or repeat the same explanation that no one was listening to anymore. I just stood there, watching, taking it all in, letting them believe this was normal. Because the next move was not going to sound like a conversation. It was going to look like a result. I turned back toward the house, already running through the details in my head, the timing, the sequence, the exact moment this would shift from their advantage to mine. And as I reached the door, one thought settled in clear and steady. Talking was no longer part of the plan. Escalation does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it shows up as routine. The following week, it was not just weekends anymore. Tuesday evening, just past 6, I heard it again, that slow roll of tires over gravel that did not belong to anyone but me. I looked up from the kitchen counter, the faint smell of reheated coffee still hanging in the air, and glanced at the monitor without even moving closer. One car, then another. Not a full event, not a crowd, just enough to test something new. That was the difference. They were no longer waiting for occasions. They were integrating it. I stepped outside, the evening heat still clinging to the ground, the air thick and quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioners and the low murmur of conversation somewhere down the block. 3 cars this time, parked clean, confident, no attempt to stay near the edge. One of them sat directly in the center line, cutting my access in half like it had always been designed that way. I stood there for a moment, hands at my sides, not moving, just observing. A man stepped out of the nearest vehicle, keys in hand, glancing at me like he expected acknowledgement, not resistance. "Evening," he said casually, like we were neighbors sharing space instead of strangers crossing a boundary. I nodded once, not returning the greeting, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him slightly uncomfortable, then turned and walked back inside without saying a word. That was new. No correction, no explanation, just absence. Behind me, I could hear the faint shift in tone, a pause in whatever conversation had been happening, like they were trying to recalibrate based on a response they did not expect. That pause told me more than any argument would have. They were starting to notice the change. Inside, I moved straight to the desk where I had spread everything out earlier that day. Maps, notes, timestamps, a growing record of something that was no longer isolated. This was pattern now. Repetition. Intent. I added 3 more entries, each one precise, each one building on the last, not because I needed proof for them, but because I was preparing for something they had not considered yet. The kind of response that does not rely on convincing anyone. The kind that operates within the exact rules they thought they were bending. I sat there for a minute after writing, listening to the muted sounds outside, doors closing, footsteps moving away, the driveway settling again under weight that should not have been there. It was almost quiet again, almost normal, but that word had lost its meaning here. Because normal had been replaced by something else, something gradual and persistent that only stops when it hits resistance that cannot be ignored. The next morning, it was still there. 1 car left overnight, parked halfway up the drive like it had been forgotten or assumed safe. The early sun hit the windshield at an angle, reflecting light straight into the house, a sharp glare that forced me to squint as I stepped outside. The air was cooler, but the irritation it caused was immediate, physical, unavoidable. I walked up to it slowly, noticing the small details. The way the tires had settled into the surface. The slight indentation where weight had pressed longer than intended. This was no longer temporary. This was occupation. I circled the car once, taking it in, committing it to memory, then stepped back and looked down the length of the driveway. Empty beyond that single vehicle, but not for long. I could already see how this would play out. 1 becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. And eventually, it is no longer questioned. At all. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, not to call, not yet, but to add another layer to what I was building. Photos, angles, context. Every piece mattered, not for them, but for what came next. I lowered the phone and looked back toward the street, where the neighborhood was just starting to wake up. sprinklers clicking on in sequence, a garage door opening down the block, someone walking a dog past the entrance without even glancing at the car sitting on my property like it belonged there. That was the final confirmation. No one saw it as a problem anymore. And that meant whatever I did next had to do more than just correct behavior. It had to reset the entire expectation. I turned back toward the house, the plan forming in clearer lines now, each step connecting to the next with the kind of precision I had not used in years. Not emotional, not reactive, structured, intentional. Because once something becomes routine, the only way to break it is with something they cannot ignore. I paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and glanced back one more time at the car sitting there, silent, unmoving, completely unaware of what it had just become part of. That was when I understood the timing. Not yet. Not today. It needed to be bigger than this. Clearer. Undeniable. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click, already shifting from watching to setting the stage. Because the next time they used my driveway, it was not going to feel routine anymore. The first crack did not come from the driveway. It came from the paperwork. I had been treating this like a physical problem, something you could see and measure, tire marks, positions, patterns, but that morning I realized the real shift had already happened somewhere less visible. I sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread out again, the same document I had reviewed twice before, the same clean lines and clear language that had convinced me this property was insulated from exactly this kind of situation. The paper felt different this time, not because it had changed, but because I was looking at it with a different question in mind. Not what it said, but what it allowed. The early light filtered through the window, casting long, thin shadows across the page, and for a moment everything was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. That kind of silence has a way of sharpening focus. I traced the boundary description with my finger, reading each line slowly, not skimming, not assuming. 32 feet wide, 180 feet long. Exclusive access easement. Maintained by owner. No shared usage implied. I had read those words before, but this time I kept going. Past the main description. Past the standard clauses most people stop at. That was where I found it. Buried in a section that most buyers never pay attention to. Written in the kind of language that feels routine until it suddenly is not. Enforcement rights. I leaned in slightly, reading it again to make sure I was not interpreting it through frustration. The wording was precise. The owner of the easement retains full authority to regulate access, restrict unauthorized use, and enforce removal of any vehicle or obstruction without prior notice, provided such enforcement complies with local towing and property regulations. I sat back slowly, letting that settle in. Without prior notice. That phrase carried weight. It meant the expectation of permission did not exist here. It meant the entire assumption they had built, that they could treat this like shared space until told otherwise, did not apply. I read it a third time, this time out loud under my breath, hearing how it sounded, how it would hold up if it needed to. It was clean, direct, no ambiguity. The kind of clause that does not need interpretation because it already defines the boundary of action. I folded the page back carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just acknowledging that something had shifted. This was not just about ownership anymore. This was about control. Outside, I heard another car roll past on the street, not turning in this time, just passing by, but the sound was enough to remind me how close this had come to becoming permanent. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking down the length of the driveway. Empty for the moment, the surface smooth again, almost like nothing had happened. But now I could see it differently, not just as space, but as leverage. Every car that had parked there. Every time someone said, Brenda said it was fine. Every assumption they made about access. All of it had been based on the idea that there would be a warning, a conversation, a chance to adjust. And that was the mistake. Because the document in my hand said otherwise. I moved back to the table and picked up my phone, scrolling through the photos I had taken over the past week. Plate numbers, angles, timestamps. It was not just a record anymore. It was context. It showed pattern, repetition, intent, all the things that matter when something moves from incidental to deliberate. I opened a new note and started organizing it, not because I needed to prove anything to them, but because I was preparing for precision. Dates aligned, times matched, positions mapped, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion. This was not accidental use. This was systematic. And that mattered. Because enforcement without context looks aggressive. Enforcement with context looks justified. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under the shift, and let the plan start to take shape in full. Not rushed. Not reactive. Structured the same way I used to approach projects when the stakes were higher and the margin for error was smaller. You do not act on the first opportunity. You act on the right one. The one that makes the outcome undeniable. I glanced at the calendar on the wall, noting the upcoming weekend, the next scheduled event that had already been mentioned in passing by more than one neighbor. Bigger turnout. More cars. More confidence. That was the moment. Not a random night. Not a partial use. A full commitment on their side, where the assumption was complete and visible. That was when the response would carry weight. I picked up the deed one more time, folding it closed with care, and set it aside. The information was already where it needed to be. The rest was timing, execution, and making sure that when the line was enforced, it was done in a way that left no room for interpretation. I walked back toward the window, looking out at the driveway again, the same stretch of land that had started this whole thing. And for the first time since it began, I was not thinking about how to stop them. I was thinking about how to let them go just far enough. Because the difference between a warning and a lesson is what happens after you let someone believe they are right. I turned away from the glass, already moving through the next steps in my head, each one lining up with the clause I had just found, each one narrowing the gap between assumption and consequence. And that was when the plan finally felt complete. I stopped looking at it like a problem and started treating it like a case. The difference was in the details. That afternoon, I turned the kitchen table into a workspace, spreading everything out in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Printed stills from the security cameras, each one stamped with date and time, arranged in sequence from the first incident to the most recent. License plate numbers written cleanly beneath each image. A map of the driveway with positions marked in pen, showing exactly where each vehicle had been parked, how far they crossed the boundary, how the placement had evolved from cautious to careless. The air inside the house smelled faintly of paper and ink, mixed with the lingering trace of asphalt from the weekend before, and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan overhead gave everything a steady rhythm that matched the way my mind was moving. Piece by piece, it came together. Not just random parking. Not convenience. A system. I stepped back from the table and looked at it from a distance, letting my eyes move across the layout the same way someone else would if they had to understand it quickly. The progression was clear. Week 1, 2 cars hugging the edge. Week 2, 6 cars, angled but controlled. Week 3, full occupation during events, extending past markers without hesitation. Midweek, use starting to appear. Overnight parking beginning to show up. This was escalation with a timeline, and timelines matter because they remove doubt. They show intent. I picked up one of the printed images, the one from Tuesday night, and held it closer. The lighting was different, softer, but the confidence in the placement was unmistakable. Centerline parking. No attempt to disguise it. That was the shift from testing to assumption. I set it back down and reached for my phone, opening the video clips I had saved. Short segments, each one capturing a moment that on its own might seem insignificant. A driver stepping out and locking their car. A quick glance. Toward the house, then away. Someone gesturing casually as they walked past, like the space behind them was already part of their route. I watched them in sequence, not for what they showed, but for what they implied. No hesitation. No uncertainty. That meant they believed they were allowed. And that belief had come from somewhere consistent. I paused the last clip and zoomed in slightly, focusing on the angle of a vehicle relative to the boundary marker. 6 inches over. Not accidental. Deliberate enough to matter. I noted it down, adding it to the list, not because I needed more evidence, but because precision reinforces certainty. When everything lines up, there is no room left for interpretation. I moved back to the map and traced the outer edge of the driveway again, following the line I had memorized by now, the one that separated what was mine from what they had decided to use. Then I started overlaying the data, where each car had been, how far each one crossed, which days showed the highest volume. The pattern tightened with each mark, forming something that looked less like parking and more like planning. That was when I understood the full picture. This was not just Brenda telling people it was fine. This was Brenda managing flow, directing use, turning my driveway into an extension of her events with the kind of quiet coordination that only works when no one challenges it in a way that disrupts the system. I leaned back slightly, letting the pen rest against the table, and took a slow breath. The room felt still, but my mind was moving faster now, connecting each piece to the clause I had found earlier. Unauthorized use. No prior notice required. Compliance with local towing regulations. That last part mattered. I reached for my laptop and pulled up the city ordinances, scrolling through the sections on private property enforcement, making sure every step I was considering aligned exactly with what was allowed. No assumptions. No shortcuts. If this was going to work, it had to be clean. I read through the requirements carefully. Proper signage. Visibility. Documentation of unauthorized use. Contracted towing service with licensed operators. Each point checked against what I already had or could put in place. One by one, the gaps closed. By the time I finished, there were no uncertainties left. Just steps. I closed the laptop and looked back at the table, at the layout of everything I had gathered, and for the first time since this started, it did not feel like I was reacting to something. It felt like I was setting terms. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, not turning in, just moving along, but the sound carried through the open window, reminding me how close this space was to being treated like it belonged to everyone. I stood there for a moment, listening, then walked over to the front door and stepped outside again. The driveway stretched out in front of me, empty for now, quiet, waiting. I walked its length slowly, counting steps without thinking about it, letting the physical space align with everything I had just mapped out. Every foot of it mattered, every inch defined. I stopped at the far end and turned back toward the house, taking in the full view the way someone arriving would see it. Open, accessible, inviting. That was the illusion, and it was the reason this had worked for them so far, because nothing about it told them otherwise. I nodded once to myself, the decision already made, then headed back inside, closing the door with a soft, final sound that felt different this time. Not reactive, not uncertain, just resolved. Because now, everything I needed was in place. The only thing left was timing. And timing, more than anything, determines how a lesson is learned. I did not handle the next step alone, because the kind of plan I was building only works when every piece moves exactly the way it is supposed to. Late Wednesday afternoon, I made a call I had not needed to make in years, scrolling through contacts until I found the one name that still carried the right kind of weight. Daniel Reeves. We had worked together back when I was still in development, when projects ran on deadlines and mistakes cost more than just time. He had been running a towing and impound operation even back then, the kind that did not advertise much, but was always exactly where it needed to be when something had to be handled cleanly. The line rang twice before he picked up, his voice the same as I remembered, steady, direct, no wasted words. Reeves. I leaned against the counter, eyes drifting toward the driveway outside. As I spoke, "It is Ethan Cole." There was a short pause, then a shift in tone, recognition settling in. "It has been a while," he said. "What do you need?" I appreciated that. No small talk. No curiosity beyond the task. I explained the situation in simple terms, not dramatized, not emotional, just facts. Private easement. Unauthorized use. Repeated incidents. Documented pattern. I could almost hear him processing it on the other end, fitting it into the framework he worked with every day. "You have signage?" he asked. "Not yet," I replied. "But I will." Another pause, shorter this time. "You know the rules," he said. "Clear notice. Visible. Once that is in place, it is enforceable." I nodded, even though he could not see it. "That is why I am calling you now." There was a faint sound in the background, maybe a truck door closing, maybe just movement, but his voice stayed focused. "You are not looking for a warning," he said. It was not a question. "No," I answered. "I am looking for consistency." That seemed to settle it. "Then you will need more than one truck," he said. "If this is as regular as you say, it will not be one or two vehicles." I glanced back at the table where the photos were still spread out, the numbers already clear in my mind. "It will not be," I said. He let out a quiet breath, not frustration, just acknowledgement. "All right," he replied. "You give me the night. I will have the crew ready." The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else that had happened so far. No argument, no hesitation, just alignment. I ended the call and set the phone down, the next step already moving into place. That evening, I drove out to pick up the signage myself, not something generic or temporary, but something clear, permanent, and impossible to ignore. The metal felt solid in my hands as I loaded it into the back of the truck, the bold lettering catching the light even before it was installed. Private property. No unauthorized parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. The language was direct, not aggressive, just factual, the kind of wording that does not invite interpretation. Back home, I took my time placing them, not rushing, making sure each one was positioned exactly where it needed to be to meet every requirement. One at the entrance, angled toward incoming vehicles. One halfway down the drive, visible from both directions. One near the house, reinforcing the message for anyone who made it that far. The process was quiet, methodical, the metallic click of bolts tightening against posts the only sound breaking the stillness of the evening. By the time I finished, the sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the driveway, each sign standing out clearly against the fading light. I stepped back and looked at the full layout, not as the owner this time, but as someone arriving from the outside. There was no ambiguity anymore. No room for assumption. The boundary was not just defined, it was stated. That was important, because what came next relied on that clarity. Inside, I updated the notes, adding the installation time, the placement details, the visibility angles. Every piece documented, every step accounted for. Not because I expected a challenge, but because I was removing the possibility of one. Precision eliminates argument. Later that night, I stood at the window again, watching the driveway under the soft glow of the new lights, the signs catching just enough illumination to remain visible even in the dark. It looked different now. Not just owned, but controlled. Outside, a car slowed as it passed the entrance, the driver's headlights briefly sweeping across the first sign before continuing down the street. No turn, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. That was the first sign it was working, not as a deterrent, but as a setup. Because the people who had been using this space were not going to stop immediately. They were going to rely on habit, on what they had been told, on the assumption that nothing had really changed. And that was exactly what I needed. I turned away from the window, the plan now fully aligned with the rules that governed it. Each step ready to unfold the moment the timing matched the pattern I had been tracking. Because once they ignored the signs, once they crossed that line again, it would not be a conversation anymore. It would be execution. And that only works when everyone involved knows exactly what their role is. I checked the calendar one more time, the date of the next event marked clearly, then set everything in place for the night that would. Finally reset the rules. By the time Friday came around, everything was already in motion, even though nothing had happened yet. That was the part most people never see, the quiet alignment before anything actually shifts. The neighborhood felt the same on the surface, the usual rhythm settling in as the weekend approached. Lawns trimmed, cars washed, the faint smell of charcoal drifting from somewhere down the street as someone got a head start on what was clearly going to be another event. I watched it all from the window without reacting, letting it unfold exactly the way it had every other time, because that predictability was what made the plan work. Around 5 in the afternoon, the first signs of it started. Not cars yet, just movement. People walking with purpose. Decorations being set up in the common area. Music testing in short bursts, cutting in and out like someone adjusting levels. It was the same setup I had seen before, just larger this time, more organized, more confident. That confidence mattered. It meant they were not expecting anything different. I stepped outside briefly, not to engage, just to observe the flow, the direction people were coming from, the way they naturally funneled toward the same areas. The driveway sat there in front of me, unchanged except for the signs now clearly visible at every entry point, catching the late afternoon light in a way that made the lettering impossible to miss. I watched as a couple walked past the entrance, their conversation slowing just slightly as their eyes passed over the sign, then continuing on. Acknowledgement, not compliance. That was exactly what I expected. Because information alone does not change behavior when habit is stronger. I went back inside and checked the monitors again, adjusting the angles slightly to ensure full coverage from every direction. Entrance, midpoint, near the house. No blind spots. Not tonight. I pulled up the contact list on my phone and confirmed the time with Daniel, keeping it simple. Everything is set. I said. We move when it is full. There was no hesitation on his end. Understood, he replied. That was all that needed to be said. I set the phone down and looked at the clock. 6:30. The window was opening. Outside, the first car turned in at 6:42. It did not hesitate. It did not slow down to read the sign. It just rolled straight onto the driveway like it had done before, tires pressing into the surface with that familiar crunch that no longer felt neutral. I watched from the monitor as the driver stepped out, locked the door, and walked away without even glancing back. The second car followed less than 2 minutes later. This one paused slightly at the entrance, headlights catching the sign directly, illuminating the words in full. For a moment, I thought they might stop. Instead, they pulled in anyway, angling slightly, but still crossing the boundary line clearly. That was the moment the line became irrelevant to them. I leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching as the pattern accelerated. 3 cars. 5. 8. Within 20 minutes, the driveway looked exactly like it had during previous events, only now every single vehicle had passed at least one clearly visible notice on the way in. That detail mattered more than anything else, because it removed the last excuse. By 7:15, it was full, not partially, not cautiously, completely. Cars lined along both sides, some parked tight against each other, others cutting into the center, leaving just enough space for someone to squeeze through if they tried hard enough. The surface I had spent weeks maintaining was now carrying more weight than it was ever meant to. The sound of footsteps and distant laughter drifting back as people moved further into the event area, leaving their vehicles behind without a second thought. I stayed inside, not moving, not reacting, letting the moment settle into exactly what it needed to be. Complete. Undeniable. This was not a misunderstanding anymore. This was a decision they had all made, one after another, based on the assumption that nothing would happen. I glanced at the clock again. 7:23. The timing was right. I picked up the phone and dialed Daniel, the line connecting almost immediately. We are ready, I said, my voice steady, controlled. It is full. There was a brief pause, then a simple response. We are on the way. I ended the call and set the phone down, the shift now irreversible. Outside, nothing had changed yet. The music still played. People still laughed. The driveway still looked like it belonged to them. But that was the last moment it would feel that way. I walked over to the window and stood there quietly, watching the stillness before impact, the calm that always comes right before a system resets itself. Because once the trucks arrived, there would be no more assumptions, no more soft boundaries, no more quiet expansion of something that was never theirs to begin with. There would only be the result of every choice they had just made. And results, unlike conversations, do not require agreement to be understood. I rested my hand lightly against the frame of the window, eyes fixed on the line of cars stretching down the driveway, and waited. The first engine would be the only warning they got. The first truck did not announce itself with noise. It announced itself with presence. At exactly 7:31, a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the street, slower than the rest, heavier, deliberate. From inside, through the monitor, I could see the difference immediately. This was not someone arriving for the event. This was someone arriving with purpose. The truck turned cleanly toward the entrance, easing up to the driveway just enough for the signage to fall directly into its line of sight, not because it needed to read it, but because everything about this moment was aligned with what those signs represented. A second truck followed 30 seconds later, then a third, each one spacing out just enough to move without interference. There was no rush. No urgency, just sequence. I watched as the first operator stepped out, reflective vest catching the ambient light, movements calm and practiced, the kind that come from doing the same job hundreds of times without needing to think about it. He walked to the nearest vehicle, glanced once at the position, then back toward the driveway entrance, as if confirming the setup. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. Inside, the music from the event continued, muffled but steady, a background layer that had not yet realized anything had changed. That was the contrast. Outside, the system was already shifting. The operator moved with efficiency, not aggressive, not hesitant, simply following procedure. Equipment positioned. Angles checked. The first vehicle lifted cleanly, the suspension adjusting slightly as the weight transferred, the entire motion smooth and controlled. No drama, just action. I exhaled slowly, watching the transition from assumption to consequence play out in real time. The second operator was already moving to the next car, repeating the process with the same precision. By the time the third truck began its first pickup, the pattern was clear. This was not a single removal. This was a sweep. The driveway that had been filled with confidence less than 10 minutes earlier was now being cleared one vehicle at a time, each one leaving in the exact order it had arrived. It took less than 5 minutes for the first shift in awareness to ripple back from the event. A man walked quickly toward the driveway, his pace slightly off from the relaxed movement of everyone else, eyes scanning ahead before locking onto the space where his car had been. He stopped mid-step, confusion settling in before anything else, then turned in a slow circle like the answer might appear if he looked hard enough. Another person followed, then another, the flow increasing as the realization spread. Voices changed tone. Not louder, just sharper, more focused. Questions replacing conversation. I stayed where I was, watching it unfold through the glass, not stepping outside, not engaging, because this moment did not need explanation from me. It explained itself. One of the drivers approached an operator, gesturing toward the empty spot, clearly asking something I could not hear, but I could read the response in the body language. Calm, direct, a point toward the sign, a brief explanation. No argument, no escalation, just information delivered the same way the signs had delivered it earlier. That was the difference. Earlier, the signs had been ignored because they were passive. Now, they were being reinforced by action. And action is harder to dismiss. More people arrived at the edge of the driveway, gathering in small clusters, looking down the length of it as more vehicles were methodically removed. Some checked their phones, likely calling or searching. Others just stood there, processing the shift from expectation to reality. I noticed one person step closer to the entrance, reading the sign again, this time slower, lips moving slightly as they followed each word. Private property. No unauthorized parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. The same words that had been visible before, now carrying a different weight. Understanding changes when it costs something. By 7:45, the driveway was half empty. The line that had once stretched from the entrance to the house was now broken into gaps, spaces opening where there had been none. The sound of engines starting up was replaced by the lower, steadier hum of tow trucks repositioning. Each movement calculated, each removal part of a sequence that did not need to speed up or slow down. It simply continued. I shifted slightly, resting my hand against the counter, feeling the cool surface under my fingers, grounding the moment in something physical as everything outside realigned. This was not chaos. It was correction, a system being reset to match the rules it had ignored. One of the operators glanced briefly toward the house, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the source of authority without needing confirmation. That small moment mattered. It showed alignment without communication, the kind of coordination that only works when every part is clear. By the time the last third of the vehicles remained, the atmosphere had changed completely. The casual confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, more aware. People stood closer to their remaining cars, not leaving them unattended anymore, not assuming they would still be there if they walked away. That was the shift I had been waiting for. Not just removal, but awareness. Because once behavior changes, the system holds. I watched as another car was lifted, the motion as smooth as the first, the pattern unbroken from start to finish. No interruptions. No confusion about what was happening. Just a steady, undeniable progression toward an empty driveway. And as the final vehicles were prepared for removal, one thought settled in clearly. They were finally paying attention. By 8:05, the driveway was empty again, but it did not feel the same as before. The air had changed, not in temperature, but in weight, like something invisible had shifted back into place. The last tow truck eased out of the entrance with the same controlled movement it had arrived with, headlights sweeping briefly across the signs before disappearing down the street. For a moment, everything went quiet. No engines idling, no doors slamming, just the distant sound of music from the event continuing as if nothing had happened, though the tone had clearly shifted. I stepped outside slowly, the night air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dust settling back over the surface that had just been cleared. The gravel under my boots sounded different again, lighter, like it had been relieved of something it was never meant to hold. A few people still stood near the edge of the driveway, not gathered the way they had been before, but spaced out, each one processing what had just happened in their own way. Conversations were quieter now, more focused, words chosen more carefully. I walked past them without stopping, not looking for reactions, not offering explanations, just moving through the space that had returned to what it was supposed to be. One man glanced at me as I passed, recognition flickering across his face, but he did not say anything. He did not need to. The understanding was already there. Further down, near the entrance, I saw Brenda. She was standing just off to the side, not in the center of attention the way she usually positioned herself, but slightly removed, watching the empty stretch of driveway with an expression that was harder to read from a distance. The clipboard was back in her hand, but it hung loosely at her side, and used. For the first time since I had met her, she looked like she was recalculating. I approached at a steady pace, not rushing, not slowing, just enough to make it clear that I was not avoiding the moment. As I got closer, she turned her head slightly, acknowledging my presence without the usual polished smile. There was a pause, just long enough to mark the difference from every previous interaction. "That was unnecessary," she said finally, her voice controlled but lacking the easy confidence it once had. I stopped a few feet away, keeping the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "It was documented," I replied. "And it was posted." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the nearest sign, then back to me, the words there now carrying a meaning they had not before. "We could have handled this differently," she said. I nodded once, not disagreeing with the possibility, just acknowledging the statement. "We tried that," I said. That was all. No argument. No escalation. Just a reminder of the steps that had already been taken and ignored. She did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting again down the driveway, following the line that had been filled less than an hour ago and was now completely clear. The absence spoke louder than anything I could have added. Around us, people were already adjusting, some leaving earlier than planned, others staying closer to their remaining vehicles. The casual flow of the event disrupted in a way that would not easily be forgotten. That was the real outcome. Not just the removal, but the reset. Behavior changes when the cost becomes real. Brenda straightened slightly, her posture returning to something closer to what I had seen before, but not quite the same. "This will be discussed," she said, more to herself than to me. I gave a small nod. "It should be," I replied. And that was it. No more needed to be said. I turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her there at the edge of the driveway, the space between us now clearly defined in a way that had not existed before. Inside, the house felt the same as it always had, quiet, controlled, insulated from the noise outside. But now there was a difference in how that quiet settled. It felt restored, not just present. I moved to the window and looked out one more time, watching as the last few people drifted away from the entrance, no longer treating it as an extension of their space, but as something separate, something they had to consider before approaching. The signs stood exactly where I had placed them, unchanged, but no longer ignored. That was the shift, not in the physical space, but in the perception of it. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding the moment, and let the scene settle into memory. Because this was not just about tonight. This was about what would happen next. Whether the line held or blurred again, whether the lesson stayed or faded. Outside, the driveway remained empty, the quiet stretching out in a way that felt intentional rather than temporary. And for the first time since this started, there was no movement toward it at all. That was when I realized the difference had already taken hold. The next morning felt different before I even opened the door. It was quiet in a way that did not feel temporary, not the kind of silence that comes between events, but the kind that settles when something has been understood. I stepped outside with my coffee, the steam rising slowly in the cool air, and looked down the length of the driveway. Clean, empty, undisturbed. No tire marks cutting across the boundary. No footprints leading away from. Cars that should not have been there. Just the surface the way I had built it, the way it was always meant to be used. The signs stood where I had placed them, catching the early light, their message no longer something to interpret, but something that had already been demonstrated. A car drove past the entrance, slower than usual, the driver's head turning just slightly as they passed, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness. That was new. It was not fear, not even hesitation, just recognition. The kind that comes after a line has been clearly drawn and reinforced. I took a sip of coffee and leaned against the railing, letting the moment settle without rushing it. Across the street, a garage door opened, then paused, as if the person inside was taking a second look at the scene before continuing. Small changes. Subtle, but consistent. That was how behavior shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in quiet adjustments that add up over time. Later that morning, I noticed something else. A delivery truck pulled up to the entrance, the driver slowing, reading the sign fully before making a careful turn that kept all 4 tires exactly where they were supposed to be. No assumption, no overreach, just alignment. I watched him step out, complete his drop, and leave without ever crossing the boundary. It took less than 2 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know. The system had reset. Around noon, I saw Brenda again. She was walking the street with her clipboard, the same route she had taken before, but her pace was different. Slower, more deliberate. When she reached the edge of the driveway, she did not step onto it this time. She stopped just short, looking down its length for a moment before continuing on. No comment, no attempt to reframe it. Just a quiet acknowledgement of where the line now stood. I did not approach her. There was no need. The conversation had already happened in a way that did not rely on words. Over the next few days, the pattern held. No cars turned in. No one tested the edges. Even during the next small gathering midweek, I watched from the window as vehicles filled the designated areas, leaving my driveway untouched, not because it was physically blocked, but because it was no longer considered available. That was the difference. Access had not changed. Perception had. And perception is what drives behavior. I kept documenting for a while, out of habit more than necessity, noting the absence instead of the presence, each empty evening reinforcing what had been established. After a week, I stopped. There was nothing left to track. The problem had resolved itself the moment consequence became part of the equation. I walked the length of the driveway one afternoon, the sun high overhead, the surface warm underfoot, and took it in from end to end. Every detail the way I had intended. Every inch serving the purpose it was designed for. It felt complete again, not because nothing would ever challenge it, but because now there was a clear understanding of what would happen if something did. I paused near the entrance, looking out toward the street where it all connected, the place where assumption had first crossed into action. The signs stood firm, unchanged, but they were no longer the only thing defining the space. The memory of what had happened here carried just as much weight. That was the real boundary. Not just the physical markers, but the experience tied to them. I turned back toward the house, the gravel shifting lightly under each step, that familiar sound returning to something that felt like it belonged again. No extra weight, no intrusion, just the steady rhythm of something used the right way. Inside, I set my keys on the counter and glanced once more toward the window, where the driveway stretched out in quiet certainty. There was no need to watch it anymore. The line had been set, and more importantly, it had been understood. I took another sip of coffee, the warmth steady, grounding, and let the final thought settle in without forcing it. Not every problem needs a louder voice. Some just need a clearer outcome. And once that outcome is seen, it does not have to be repeated. It simply stays in place, shaping what happens next.